Chapter 1926. Linda hugged the child and ignored him. In her eyes, he was a man who was obsessed with sex and had no integrity. How could he be like this, pouncing on the bed the moment they met? It wasn't that she didn't feel wronged. He used his power to threaten her with the child. The more she thought about it, the more she hated him. She cursed him, old man do, countless times. It was better if he couldn't get it done. Look at how he was still fooling around with women. She remained silent, not making a sound, and ignored him. Du Yuesheng looked at her little expression. How could he not guess what she was thinking? A woman's struggle was nothing more than whether a man's body was loyal, and whether his feelings were loyal. In terms of feelings, he had indeed given up on her once, so there was nothing much to say. But his body, originally, he wanted to be jealous of her, but seeing her sad and even disgusted look, he couldn't bear to do it. He squatted in front of her, and their eyes were level. His large palm held one of her small hands, and gently called out to Shanshan. "Don't call me that. You don't deserve it." Linda's eyes were a little red as she said softly. She told herself that she hated him and would ignore this man in the future. But why did he still appear? Du Yuesheng, feelings aren't something you can have just because you want them, and it's not something you can give up at any time. Do you understand? She bit her lip, and her voice was a little choked. In front of him, she was still a very pure little girl. How could her little schemes be enough to fight with him? Du Yuesheng reached out and stroked her slender hair. He was full of tenderness, as if he was treating a junior. Linda pushed him away. This old pervert. When he was torturing her, he didn't have this kind of patience. He was extremely rude. Du Yuesheng smiled, understanding that the little girl was angry at him. Most importantly, she disliked him for being dirty. "Shenshen," he called out to her again. His voice was elegant and magnetic, and even had a hint of love. She still ignored him, but he didn't mind. He still said in a low voice, "Look, you've hit me, scolded me, and vented your anger. Can you let me say a few words?" She wanted to stubbornly say no, but she swallowed the words. Why should she care about him? Du Yuesheng only felt that she was so cute. He rubbed her, and then rubbed little Longyue's sparse fur. Only then did he say in a low voice, "Indeed, I had many women in the past, but I didn't mess around. They were all bought with money, the kind that wouldn't cause any trouble." Just as he finished speaking, his shan exploded. "Mr. Du, you also spent 5 million to settle me. I don't want any trouble either. It's me who wants to trouble you." Du Yuesheng smiled and pressed her forehead against it. Somewhat forcefully, she held her in her arms. "In fact, during the month we were separated, I still had other women. Not many, but I did come into contact with a few." Linda was so angry that she was powerless. "Fine, even if it wasn't me at that time, you still liked Sister Liangqiu, didn't you?" Du Yuesheng didn't avoid it. What kind of person was he? He didn't want to hide it from her. He smiled faintly and said, "But at that time, your sister Liangqiu didn't agree to be with me, right?" She glared at him. He was so sly. Du Yuesheng smiled slightly. "Then let's continue." His voice deepened. "Ever since I knew that you were pregnant with my child, I didn't have any other women." She was stunned. Chapter 1927. He explained to her in a gentle voice. She was shocked and looked at him with her mouth wide open. "Shanshan, don't despise me. Don't despise an old man in his early 40s who finally fell in love with a girl, okay?" He pressed his face against the side of her face. "Shanshan, even if you like my money, it's okay?" She asked gloomily, "Give it all to me? I can give you my cash and real estate, except for the shares of the family business, which I can't touch." He actually answered her question very seriously. Linda forced herself to cheer up and asked lazily, "How much property do you have?" "About tens of billions." Du Yuesheng frowned. "You have to ask my financial advisor." Linda lay flat. "Du Yuesheng, were you too stingy in the past? You wanted to buy a child with 100 million? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. An angry little girl was really difficult to deal with. He couldn't coax her for a long time, so he simply gave up. Anyway, he had already told her that whether she agreed or not, she had to marry him. After Linda finished feeding the child, she adjusted her clothes and laid Long Yu down. After looking at the little fellow's little face for a while, she lightly got up. Du Yuesheng, wait for me in the hall outside. I'll come out after I take a shower. She paused. Don't go to the bathroom. I don't want to talk to you there. Du Yuesheng showed a look of pity, but he still went outside first. It was a good thing that she was willing to talk. Linda watched him go out, pursed her lips, and walked into the bathroom. 10 minutes later, she came out, put on her clothes, and went to the hall. Surprisingly, Du Yuesheng wasn't sitting in the living room, but was busy in the kitchen. There was a fragrance of food floating in the air. It was very homey, especially when he was wearing a small apron. It was very funny. Linda slowly sat on the sofa, watching him busy, a little absent-minded. He had only said some things before and did not say everything, but she had already guessed it. From the day he got married, he wanted to divorce, so he found those women to anger Lin Shimin. Why did he do this? Her heart was beating wildly. When she came back to her senses, he had already prepared the dishes and came to call her. What are you thinking about? His voice was a little gentle. Linda looked up, and her brain asked a shameful question involuntarily. Aren't you tired? He did it 5 times in the afternoon. For a man in his early 40s, this was already an incredible thing. Du Yuesheng smiled. In fact, if you're willing, I can do it 5 more times. He paused for a moment and deliberately teased her. After all, I haven't had sex for more than a year. I can't help it. Because of a little girl's thoughts, I have to endure it, but I'm still called dirty. Her face was a little hot. After a while, she stood up and said, I'm hungry. Let's eat first. At this time, it was already nightfall. It seemed that he had spent the entire morning and afternoon in bed. Du Yuesheng took great care of her, as if she was his little daughter. After a while, his gaze fell on a certain part of her, his eyes burning. Drink some soup, this way little Long Yue will have enough to eat. Her face was a little hot, and she drank the soup without asking. The meal was eaten in silence. Everyone had their own thoughts. Chapter 1928. Linda sat on the sofa and hugged her knees as she looked at him. There was a hint of caution in her eyes. She was really afraid of him, afraid that he would take the child away. However, when she opened her mouth, she said something that went against her heart. Du Yuesheng, I can go with you, but we agreed. He was about to wash the dishes when he heard her words. His body stiffened and his hands stopped moving. He asked softly, Shanshan, are you sure? Linda pursed her lips and smiled. Do I have a choice? He turned around and looked at her seriously. You have a choice. He came over and squatted in front of her with an apron around his waist. Shanshan, you can spend 5 million to find a killer to kill me. Then, you can have Long Yue and inherit all my assets. You don't have to marry me and you can have everything. What you're saying now is very hateful. Her voice was emotionless. He smiled and rubbed her hair. Shanshan, you can't bear to part with me, can you? Shanshan, you still like me, don't you? Du Yuesheng. I'm doing it for the child. She sighed. It has nothing to do with liking or love. She said calmly, I can't like a man who has given up on me. She smiled softly. Old man Du, what should I do? I can't like you anymore. Du Yuesheng was extremely sad when he heard that. His slender fingers clasped her little head in his arms and he closed his eyes. If you don't like me, then don't like me. Shanshan, don't force yourself. I hope you can be happy. She cried in his arms. Du Yuesheng, you're a bastard. I won't be happy if I marry you. Du Yuesheng's heart ached slightly. After a while, he said self-deprecatingly, why don't you try? 10 years later, 20 years later, Shanshan, tell me if you're happy or not. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything else. She knew that she had compromised. It wasn't just his threat, but also that he liked Long Yue. He could give the child a complete family. She told herself that that was all. There was nothing else. Du Yuesheng took half a year to get a divorce and a day to get Linda. He was extremely fast. After coming to B City, he already had a wife and a child. Linda was bound to go back to Hong Kong with him. Before leaving, he went to see Liang Qiu and Qin Anlin with her. When she saw Qin Anlin, Du Yuesheng felt her heart bleed. We're all old men. Is it necessary to make our faces look so good? Qin Anlin sat in the spacious hall. The sunlight shone on him, making him look extremely handsome. Linda glanced at old man Du beside her and snorted softly, "See, this is called strength." Du Yuesheng touched her face. "Why don't I go back and have my face disfigured too? I can do whatever I want. Why don't you just make him into a woman?" Linda snorted coldly. "Childish." Du Yuesheng carried the child with one hand and touched her nose with the other. Who was the childish one here? As soon as she sat down, Yi Liangqiu came down from upstairs. She was talking to Linda and ignored Du Yuesheng. She was probably angry about what happened before. Du Yuesheng could only chat with Qin Anlin. However, that face was an eyesore no matter how she looked at it. Qin Anlin folded the newspaper and said indifferently, "Why? Are you going to bring Linda to Hong Kong?" Chapter 1929. Qin Anlin smiled faintly. "No, I just thought that you wouldn't marry Lin Shimin at that time." Du Yuesheng said helplessly, "I have my reasons." "You regretted it on the day of your wedding, didn't you?" Qin Anlin hit the nail on the head. "Nothing can force you. You were just angry at Linda for being immature. But on the day of your wedding, your heart softened and you regretted it again." Qin Anlin recounted old man Du's experience unpleasantly, which made Du Yuesheng's heart turn cold. Liangqiu. He couldn't let Shanshan hear these words. He had tried so hard to beautify it. If she heard it, would she still be willing to go to Hong Kong with him? Even if she went, she probably wouldn't let him touch her. He sighed. "Shanshan used to have me in her heart, but now, I really can't grasp it." He smiled bitterly. "She probably hates me." She felt that he didn't love her enough. This time, he only came back to look for her because of the child. However, she didn't know that the rich families in Hong Kong never lacked women to give birth to children. If he didn't want to, he wouldn't have been able to give birth to the child. Because it was her that night, he had never thought of abandoning the child. She had ignored the extent of his love for her, and he didn't look down on her. Qin Anlin was right. He regretted it on the night of their wedding, but it was useless. At that time, Lin Shimin was already waiting for him in a bathrobe. That night, he pretended to be drunk to avoid it. That night, he lay in bed and schemed against his wife so that he could return to his Shanshan's side, so that she wouldn't cry in the future. Du Yuesheng fell into his memories. After a long time, he chuckled softly. "Anlin, I've never had strong feelings for Shanshan. It's just a faint liking, but I feel that this liking makes me very happy." He continued, "I will also work hard to make Shanshan happy." Qin Anlin turned his head and looked at his wife. Liangqiu also turned her head to look at him and smiled faintly. No one objected to Du Yuesheng taking Linda away because they all knew that on the day of Du Yuesheng's wedding, Linda had cried for a very long time. She did not say anything after that, but the name of the child proved that she had always been thinking of Du Yuesheng. Now she was right in front of him. Du Yuesheng liked Linda, so why not give her a chance? Linda, on the other hand, was confused. She was extremely indignant. Du Yuesheng was so hateful, yet she didn't even spare Sister Liangqiu. "If he bullies you, come back and tell me," Liangqiu said. Linda was stunned again. This was really different from what she had imagined. She had more or less thought that Sister Liangqiu would object, and even give old man Du 2 tight slaps. There's nothing wrong with liking someone. Yi Liangqiu smiled. Linda, this little fool, really didn't she know that she had always liked Du Yuesheng and had been waiting for him in B City? She didn't have to worry now because the one who was loved was the happiest. Linda didn't know that she was probably the happiest person in her heart. Linda looked at this and that, then slowly said, "Why do I feel like I've been pushed into a pit of fire? I promise it's not a pit of fire." Du Yuesheng. Old man Du smiled. "Shanshan, I've been working out recently, but you haven't been by my side for the past year, so I don't know the effect." Linda glared at him. Can he have some face in someone else's house? Also, his current behavior was like that of a retard. She told herself that she should care for a retard. She pitied him. Chapter 1930. When Yi Liangqiu sent Linda to the airport, she was reluctant to let her go. After all, Linda had been by her side for so long. Rather than calling her a subordinate, she was more like a sister, just like Su Cheng. Linda was also crying at the airport, looking very reluctant. Du Yuesheng kept sighing at the side. Later, he really couldn't take it anymore. He came over and hugged the baby with one hand and her with the other. Seeing that you're crying like a child, it's not like you're not coming back. Linda was still crying, and her nose was red from crying. Du Yuesheng had no choice but to take a tissue and wipe her tears and snot not too gently. To be honest, he really wasn't used to doing such things. Linda cried all the way until they boarded the plane. She said tearfully, "If he bullies me, Sister Liangqiu, you have to take me in." "I won't." Yi Liangqiu smiled and also wiped Linda's tears. She actually knew in her heart that Linda was just feeling uneasy. She was afraid. Du Yuesheng kept hugging the baby and didn't show any impatience. When it was time, he gently hugged Linda and boarded the private plane. When the plane took off, Yi Liangqiu watched as the gray got higher and higher, farther and farther away, and finally turned into a small. She felt a little cold in her heart. Only then did she believe that Linda would really settle down in Hong Kong for a long time. Hong Kong is so close. We can meet at any time. Qin Anlin was wearing a thin coat. He stood beside her and held her shoulder. "Let's go back. We still have to have dinner with Tang Yu and Chi-Chi tonight." Yi Liangqiu grunted in agreement. She held his arm and walked with him to the parking lot. In the early winter morning, the sun shone on her body. It was a little warm. She rested her face on the coat on his shoulder and smelled the sunshine. It was the smell of happiness. They got into the car. He drove all the way to the Qin family's cemetery. Qin Pei, Lady Qin, Aunt Su, they were resting here forever. Yi Liangqiu and Qin Anlin stood side by side. He looked indifferent, while Liangqiu was smiling. After standing quietly for a while, she suddenly looked up at him and smiled mischievously. "Do you think Aunt Su will be Dad's concubine?" Qin Anlin's face darkened and he looked at his wife speechlessly. "Liangqiu, you think too much." She hugged his arm and smiled more sweetly. The winter sun shone on her, and she looked very soft. Qin Anlin lowered his head and patted her head. "All right, let's go back." She grunted and rested her head on his shoulder, looking as if she couldn't walk. Qin Anlin had no choice but to carry her to the car. Before getting in the car, he pressed her against the door and kissed her fiercely. He was kissing her, but she kept smiling and blocked his lips. "Anlin, your parents will see." Qin Anlin's breathing was heavy. "Didn't you say that he was busy looking for a concubine?" With that said, he bit her neck twice as a punishment. Yi Liangqiu said coquettishly, "Anlin, we will be seen. We still have to eat later." He finally stopped. His fingers gently touched the bruise on her neck and he smiled faintly. "I thought you weren't afraid." His gaze was too gentle and she kept looking at it. After a moment, she took the initiative to tiptoe and kiss his lips. Under his gaze, she lowered her eyes and played with the button of his coat. She said in a low voice, "Anlin, hmm?" He looked at her with a deep gaze. Chapter 1931. She knew that he had always been worried that his injuries would scare her. It had been almost a year, and they still did it with the lights off, but she wanted to see him and see his passionate look. "Are you sure?" His voice was a little hoarse, and his eyes were fixed on her. Yi Liangqiu nodded and hugged his waist. "I think we can be a normal husband and wife." Qin Anlin's heart palpitated. A moment later, he lowered his head and kissed her lightly. "Okay, let's try." Half carrying her, he brought her to the car and drove towards Tang Yu's villa. Today was family day, and the two families had dinner together. Ever since Yi Muyun came to live in the Tang family, they seemed to have decided to spend Saturday together. It just so happened that Yi Muyun came back from America and also participated. When Qin Anlin and Yi Liangqiu arrived, the servants had already prepared a sumptuous lunch. Of course, the adults had their own table and the little ones had their own table. Qin Anlin looked at the 6 little ones. The oldest one was his, and the youngest one was his. Tang Yu had worked hard for so many years, but he only had one little heart. He wiped the sweat in his heart and thought proudly that he finally had something better than Tangyu. Yi Muyun sat at the head of the small dining table. On one side were Momo and Mumu, and behind them were the two little ones, En and Lanlan. As for the other side, only the little princess, Tang Xuan, or Xiaoxin, was sitting. Yi Muyun, who was 11 years old, was so precocious that he didn't look like a child. He calmly took care of Mommy and Mumu while they ate, but he paid more attention to Xen. He cut the heart-shaped steak that girls liked into beautiful pieces and put it away for her. Xiaoxin probably didn't have a good appetite. After eating 2 pieces, she didn't want to eat anymore. In the end, it was Yi Muyun who fed her. Qin Anlin watched quietly, then turned to Yi Liangqiu and said, "You know how to take care of people at such a young age." Yi Liangqiu glanced at him and said, "He is redeeming himself to a woman for you." Qin Anlin looked at his wife silently and didn't say anything. Tang Yu and Pei Qiqi looked at each other and smiled. Pei Qiqi immediately fell into Tang Yu's arms. "Tang Yu, it seems that Liangqiu has completely dominated Anlin." Qin Anlin looked at Yi Liangqiu meaningfully and said in a low voice, "Liangqiu, you seem to be able to control me." His voice was hoarse and warm. Yi Liangqiu's face suddenly heated up. She rolled her eyes at him and pursed her lips without saying anything. Qin Anlin began to laugh, laughing extremely happily. He couldn't help but drink a few more cups. Yi Liangqiu originally wanted to remind him that he had to drive back, but she thought that he probably hadn't been so happy for a long time, so she let him be. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she drove back with him. The children temporarily stayed at Tang Yu's place because Pei Qiqi liked children. Tang Yu didn't want to spend time with the two of them. It was because he couldn't have children. When Yi Liangqiu drove back to the villa where they lived, it was already dark. When the car drove through the black carved gate, the lights of the whole villa were turned on. The warm light in Yi Liangqiu's heart also seemed to light up and warm. The car stopped. She turned her head and looked at Qin Anlin. He was slightly drunk and was leaning against the back of the chair, sleeping lightly. "Anlin, we're here," she said softly, then turned her body slightly and helped him unfasten the seatbelt. Chapter 1932. She nodded and asked him softly, "Are you still feeling unwell?" He shook his head and stroked her long hair. "How can I feel unwell when you're around?" Every day of happiness was wonderful. It was all given to him by God. He loved her more and more every day. He loved the mother of his child so much that he couldn't stop loving her. Yi Liangqiu buried her face in his chest. "Anlin, I think," he covered her lips. "I know what you want to say." He sighed. "It's enough. It's been long enough. If you want to do it, then do it. Liangqiu, let bygones be bygones." She has also been punished. Lying in his arms, she was a little surprised that he knew her so well. He smelled slightly tipsy, and it was a little seductive, mixed with the scent of a mature man. Yi Liangqiu lay in his arms and raised her head to kiss him. She murmured, "Anlin, in the car, hm?" He pressed her head and said in a hoarse voice, "Didn't you say to turn on the lights? HM?" She buried herself in his arms and was busy like a little fairy. "Let's do it in the car first, then go home." She really wanted to do it in the car. She wasn't joking. Qin Anlin was getting impatient, but he still restrained himself and pulled her long hair gently. "Liangqiu, the car will vibrate." "Then let it vibrate." Yi Liangqiu reached out and pulled the collar of his shirt, looking like a little wild cat. "The servants will see it." There was a hint of laughter in Qin Anlin's voice. His big palm pulled her long hair gently and he was not so anxious anymore. "Then let them see." Yi Liangqiu sat directly in his arms and nibbled his neck. Her voice was also warm. "Anlin, I want you." He suddenly kissed her lips, and the kiss was intense. After a while, Yi Liangqiu regretted it. She just wanted to do it slowly, but he was unusually intense. "Anlin, the car is shaking." She desperately tried to stop him, her face hot. "Then let it shake." His voice was hoarse. Yi Liangqiu was about to cry. "The servants will see it." "Then let them see." Qin Anlin chuckled, then sealed her lips and kissed her forcefully until her body went limp. In the end, she bit his shoulder and said angrily, "Qin Anlin, you're too hateful." He chuckled and finally let her off. He tidied her up slowly and leaned over. Liangqiu, let's continue in the bedroom, okay? She sat in his arms, her clothes untied. She cried softly, Qin Anlin, you're a beast. Now you know that I'm a beast. He patted her face. I haven't taught you a lesson in a long time. How dare you flirt with me like this, huh? She lay on his shoulder and bit his shoulder. She said shameless things, which made him even angrier. He carried her and walked to the main residence. She immediately buried herself in his arms, not daring to look. It's the holidays. He found it funny and kissed her. Liangqiu, open your eyes and look. I don't want to look. She acted like a spoiled little girl, hugging his neck and hugging him so tightly that he felt like his soul was about to leave him. His large palms slapped her hard. Behave yourself. But not only did she not let go, she hugged him even tighter. That night, she clung to him. The lights were bright and bright. In the end, she lay in his arms, sweating profusely, and raised her head to kiss him. It seems quite exciting. Chapter 1933. Qin Anlin pressed down on Yi Liangqiu for the entire night. When they woke up the next morning, Yi Liangqiu looked at herself in the mirror, then went back to the room and jumped onto Qin Anlin, pouncing and biting him. Can you still see my body? He chuckled softly and reached out to caress her neck. Didn't you say it was exciting? He leaned over and said shamelessly in her ear, there's still time. Do it again? She messed around for a while and didn't dare to move anymore. She lay on his shoulder obediently, biting her lip and looking at him. Oh. They didn't do anything else. They just leaned against each other, indescribably gentle. Liangqiu? He whispered in her ear. After the surgery, I seemed to be a little excited, perhaps because the topic was too intimate. He bit her ear lightly as he said that. Her face was hot too. She played dumb. What? Don't play dumb. Do you want me to tell you with my actions, huh? His voice was suppressed, but there was a hint of joy in it. Because it was too blissful, too perfect. Yi Liangqiu smiled lightly and hugged him, burying her face in his chest. After a while, she said warmly, got it? After a while, she said especially obediently, I can feel it. Qin Anlin's heart instantly fluttered again. She hugged him tightly and frowned. Anlin, it's a little painful. He stared blankly for a moment, then immediately helped her check and applied medicine. Everything was done carefully, as if she was a fragile treasure. However, when he was tormenting her, he was ruthless. That was why men were contradictory creatures. The more they treated you seriously, the more ruthless they would be when they went crazy. Yi Liangqiu rested for a day. At 5 in the afternoon, she changed into a dress and put on some light makeup. She and Qin Anlin went to pick up the children to attend Keim's birthday party. Gem Hotel. Keim's 30th birthday was held quite grandly. After all, his current status was there. Qin Anlin's appearance inevitably caused a commotion, but he didn't interact too much with the senior management of King Entertainment. He was a person who had left the world. Now that he had returned, he did not deliberately enter the world. He was still the king of the dark night, still manipulating the stock market on Wall Street, while King Entertainment had always been managed by Liangqiu. Keim took He Huan with him. He Huan was already 5 years old, and it had been 5 years since Su Cheng left. While everyone was celebrating, Keim's eyes felt a little hot. Every time he saw He Huan, he would be reminded of Su Cheng. He could stare at He Huan's face for an entire night because it was as if her face had been peeled off from Su Cheng's face. Now that he was in a high position and had a luxurious life, he was still lonely, just an ordinary father. A man would not be happy without the woman he loved by his side. Even if they could see each other a few days a year, it was far from enough. The crystal lights refracted every inch of the scenery. The atmosphere was getting more and more lively, but the loneliness in Keim's heart was getting deeper and deeper. He held a glass of red wine in his hand as he looked at the crowd. A bitter smile appeared on his face as he slowly turned his head to look at the dark night outside. But he saw his little fairy in an orange gown. Su Cheng stood there, wearing light makeup and an expensive gown on her slender body. As she stood there, Time seemed to return to the past. She was still that little princess. Kime's eyes felt a little hot, and the surroundings seemed to have quietened down. After a while, he slowly walked over and stopped in front of her. He smiled slightly and said, "Ching, can you dance with me?" She placed herself in his hands, and he held her in his arms all of a sudden. Finally, she returned to his side and did not leave. "Thank you, Anlin." Yi Liangqiu gently hugged Qin Anlin and smiled slightly. "We will all be happy in the future, right?" He smiled and lowered his head to kiss her. "I will work hard. In the car, on the sofa, in the bathroom, whatever Mrs. Qin wants, I can do it." Chapter 1934. 9 years later. At the entrance of B City's top university, cars were everywhere. The most eye-catching was a limited edition Bugatti Veyron parked by the roadside. The smooth body of the car exuded a unique sense of respect under the setting sun. The car door was opened, and a youthful girl sat in the front passenger seat. Her school bag was also thrown into the back seat. Tang Sher, Little Heart, was wearing the B University uniform. The ordinary uniform looked indescribably good on her, especially the cotton socks and the small portion of her tender calves that was exposed between the folds. Her skin was so fair that it was almost transparent. Yi Muyun's beautiful fingers held the steering wheel. He turned his face sideways, and his chiseled facial features revealed his displeasure. "Why are you 5 minutes late?" Although he was just asking casually, her whole body was tense. Yi Muyun was the most lenient. He was even more lenient than her own parents. She pursed her lips and lowered her eyes. After a while, she sneaked a peek at him and realized that he was looking at her attentively, as if he would not give up until he got an answer. She muttered in her heart, "Domineering." However, although she was dissatisfied, she was still very afraid of him. She did not dare to show it and answered honestly, "Today is the student council election. I became a student on duty." "Sweeping the floor?" Yi Muyun sneered. His slender fingers were on the steering wheel, and he had already made the decision for her. Reject it. In his opinion, this kind of thing was a waste of time and life. It was meaningless. However, Tang Sher was silent. She lowered her head and stroked the corner of her clothes with her little hand. He tilted his head and looked at her side profile. The 18-year-old girl had already grown up. Her eyebrows were picturesque, and her small nose was tall and straight. She was lively and bright, and her little mouth was rosy and moist. He remembered that sweet taste. When he spoke again, his voice was tense. "You're not willing?" "Yes." She nodded honestly. After a while, she raised her head and looked at him with a light gaze. "Brother." Her voice was timid, and it carried the fear she had for him since she was young. This word "big brother" made Yi Muyun's heart sink fiercely. He had never been her brother, not in name or by blood. When he was 14 years old, he finished all of his university studies and came to live with the Tang family. She had always been afraid of him, but she still called him Big Brother with a trembling voice. She called him that for 6 years. She couldn't change, but he didn't ask her to. After studying abroad for 3 years, when he came back, he was 17 and she was 15. They were still as green as a fruit. 3 years had passed, and he had made a name for himself in Boyi, sitting in the position of vice president. She, on the other hand, was already an 18-year-old girl. They were only 2 years apart, but he was older than her by more than a few years. But he would rather she stay like this forever, weak and slender, in his arms, waiting for her at any time. At this time, he was confused by her calling him Big Brother. After a while, he faintly said, "You like it?" Tang Sher nodded again. "I want to make more friends." "Friend?" He raised an eyebrow. "Don't you like me accompanying you?" As he spoke, his voice was low and slightly raspy. He didn't sound like a 20-year-old boy. Tang Sher secretly cursed Shin Yin in her heart. Here he goes again. In front of him, she would always be weak and afraid. He always decided everything for her. What school she went to, what clothes she wore, and even the friends she made. She didn't live under his wings, but under his shadow. Chapter 1935. She didn't make a sound. Yimuyun stretched out two slender fingers and pinched her chin gently. You don't like it, huh? Tang Shuet lifted her eyes and looked at his young and handsome face. He was extremely good-looking, but he was too cold and had a maturity that didn't match his age. His current look was what she was most afraid of. It was as if he wanted to eat her up. I like it. In the end, she still gave in to his long and powerful aura. She lowered her eyes and didn't dare to look at his handsome face. He was undoubtedly an extremely outstanding person. He was only 2 years older than her, but he was already in control of life and death in the business world. And facing such an outstanding person like him, she felt pressured. In his eyes, she was just like a rice worm. They didn't have much in common. Whenever they were alone, she would be afraid. She was afraid that he would kiss her, because when he kissed her, her body would feel as if she had been electrocuted. It was extremely uncomfortable. She couldn't control that feeling. So whenever he looked like he wanted to eat her up, she would pretend to sleep or do her homework. Just like now. He had been on a business trip for a week and had come to pick her up from school the moment he came back. And now he was looking at her like that. She instinctively struggled and wanted to avoid it, but he used a little more strength in his fingers. Her fair chin instantly turned a little green. Her skin was extremely fragile. She couldn't be touched since she was young. A single touch would leave a mark for a few days. He wouldn't use force on her easily. But they hadn't seen each other for a week and he did miss her. He unbuckled his seatbelt and lowered his head to kiss her. Tang Sher instinctively retreated. Her eyes were filled with helplessness as she looked at him with wide eyes. His lips were imprinted on her lips. It was very soft and had the coolness of a young man. It smelled good. It was numb as if she had been electrocuted. She was so scared that she didn't dare to close her eyes. She opened her eyes and looked at his lowered eyes. He was handsome and had been controlling her for a long time. It seemed like it was natural for them to become a couple. But, in her heart, she felt that it was unreal. She always felt that such an outstanding person like him, why would he bother her? Just when she was distracted, her little face was cupped and he began to test the depth of his kiss. This was what she was most afraid of. Her eyelashes trembled, her breathing stopped, and her little mouth was tightly pursed. But he had always been strong, so he still succeeded. Taking advantage of the situation, he whispered her nickname, Xiaoxin. His masculine scent invaded her body. She was so scared that she grabbed his shoulder. Her fair and slender fingers gripped his shirt tightly, leaving a long crease on it. No matter how many times she tried, she was still afraid and not used to it. However, he suddenly kissed her, venting all the longing he had for the past week in this kiss. Her slender body was like a reed in the wind. She could only cling to him and let him do whatever he wanted. A hopeless struggle, a complete entanglement, at the school gate where people came and went. After a long time, he seemed to be finally satisfied and withdrew from her lips. His unfathomable gaze was still locked onto her, staring at her with a burning gaze. Did you miss me? Chapter 1936. She leaned against the back of the chair, her red lips trembling slightly. There was a touch of moisture on her lips, which was really very seductive. She didn't understand why he liked kissing so much. It was obviously numb and painful, at least she felt that way. Could it be that he was very comfortable? Yi Muyun lifted his body slightly, but he didn't completely return to his original position. He was still hovering above her, his gaze deep, his slender fingers stroking her lips lightly. His voice was a little hoarse. Fasten your seatbelt. Tang Sher was stunned and didn't come back to her senses for a long time. His handsome face was so close, his tall nose was even rubbing against hers. It was slightly cold, but his breath was frighteningly hot. She unconsciously bit her lips and made a sound of agreement. She was obedient and confused. He couldn't help but lean forward and kiss her lips lightly again for a while. This time, she didn't catch him, but clutched the hem of her dress tightly. She was so nervous that her whole body was stiff. In the end, he left and gazed deeply at her lips. Scared? She shook her head randomly and looked at him with her eyes wide open. He smiled as if he was pleased and stroked her long hair. You're still scared? I'm not. Tang Cher clenched her small fists and said softly but stubbornly. He stroked her long hair again, as if she was his little pet. That night, show that you're not scared. Him? That night. She suddenly deflated and looked at him with a bitter face. Did he really have to kiss her? Her eyes were so pitiful. Could he not kiss her? Yi Muyun felt helpless in her heart and softened a little. What a child. He still buckled her seatbelt personally. Let's go home. This home was the Tang family. He had been living here for many years, and he was like a part of this family. Also recognized it. Except when he kissed her, except when he looked at her with a devouring gaze. At that time, Tang Cher would happily think that it would be great if he lost his appetite for her one day. How great would it be if he changed to another person to nibble on? Sometimes she would look in the mirror and feel that she was very thin. Other than her skin being a little better, she didn't have much flesh. Fortunately, he only liked to kiss her and had no intention of exploring her. Along the way, he did not speak. He wound down the car window and played some soothing music. At the red light, he didn't chat with her, and she peeked at him. Just looking at him made his heart beat wildly. She was still so afraid of him. What are you looking at? He asked calmly, his long hand reaching for the control in front of him as if he wanted to grab a cigarette, but he only touched it for a moment before putting it down again. Her heart beat faster again. She just looked at him like that? He smokes? He was only 20 years old. But then she remembered that he was already the vice president of a multinational company. It was not strange for him to smoke. Yi Muyun withdrew his hand. He didn't smoke in front of the little girl. He only turned his head to look at her and coldly spat out 3 words, coward. She pursed her lips in dissatisfaction, turned her face to the side, and looked out of the car. However, she didn't notice that his gaze had become gentle in an instant. The car entered the traffic again, and about an hour later, they arrived at the Tang family's main residence. Tang Yu and Pei Chichi lived here as well. However, they often traveled abroad, so only Yi Muyun and Tang Cher lived here. Chapter 1937. It was a big deal that young Master Yi and Miss were back together. Young Master had gone on a business trip for a week. Now that he was back, he had to make up for it. Yi Muyun got off the car. She was only wearing a simple white shirt and beige trousers. At 184 centimeters, she was tall and well-built. She was a natural clothes rack, especially with her long legs. When she got off the car, she stole the limelight. The little servant at home covered her face. So handsome. He alighted from the car first, then went to the front passenger seat. He opened the car door and saw that the little one was still not moving. He raised an eyebrow and looked at her. We're home. Daddy and Mommy aren't home. She looked up and did not answer his question. Yi Muyun's face was slightly cold. So, I'll torture you well. As he said that, he bent over and unbuckled her seatbelt. He grabbed her little hand and strode towards the main house. Tang Cher followed behind him awkwardly. She bit her lip. Let go of me. Call me brother. His voice was still cold. Bad guy. She thought to herself, but still softly called out, Big brother? The girl's soft voice sounded lovely, and his heart softened a little. He stopped in his tracks and turned around, letting her bump into his arms, her face resting on his shoulder. Her nose hurt, and she let out a yelp. Yi Muyun supported her with one hand and lifted her little face with the other. Your nose hurts? Her nose was red, and there was a touch of moisture in her eyes. She looked pitiful. He replied softly, but he quickly pinched her nose hard. She screamed in pain. However, he chuckled softly. His voice was a little joyful, but it also had the unique naughtiness of a young man. She looked up and glared at him. He leaned closer. Everyone's watching. It'll be embarrassing if you cry. His handsome face was so close to hers, good-looking and annoying at the same time. When she was angry, she forgot everything. She opened her little mouth, revealing a row of sharp teeth, and bit the tip of his nose to vent her anger. His gaze suddenly became deep and clear, and he looked at her with a burning gaze. Our Tang Shuang, on the other hand, was filled with regret. Why did she take the initiative to provoke this demon king without any fear of death? Yi Muyun stared at her for about a minute. His gaze looked like he was going to eat her up. Tang Sher didn't dare to make a sound. Her little face blushed, and she lowered her head, not daring to look at him. He held her hand and continued to walk into the living room, lecturing her. "Don't bite people in the future," he said her like she was a dog. She was unhappy, but there was nothing she could do. They sat on the sofa, waiting for dinner. Yi Muyun sat with his long arms and legs, holding a business magazine in his hand. His posture was casual, but he was still insanely good-looking. Tang Shui, on the other hand, was playing her game. With the Demon King around, she kept her voice low, afraid that she would piss him off. She felt bitter in her heart. This was clearly her home, but he seemed more like the owner of the house. Especially when Daddy and Mommy weren't at home, he acted like her guardian, sending her to and from school every day. He even had to go through her homework. She secretly thought that if someone didn't know better, they would think that he was her little daddy. Perhaps because she had relaxed, she felt a little uncomfortable sitting down, so she switched to lying on her side. She felt uncomfortable again, so she switched to lying down with her feet facing him. Chapter 1938. His face suddenly turned red. After all, he was a young man who didn't know how to do things between a man and a woman, yet he was acting like this in front of him. He suddenly remembered that it would be her 18th birthday next month. His long eyelashes lowered, hiding the excitement in his eyes, but he couldn't look away. But the girl who had been seen naked was still clueless. Her legs were swinging back and forth, beautiful and charming, dazzling his eyes. He was no longer in the mood to look at the magazine in his hand. He only wanted to look at her. Auntie Lee came over to call for dinner and saw this scene. She was experienced, so how could she not know what a young boy and girl were thinking? She pursed her lips and smiled, feeling happy. Although young Master Yi wasn't a member of the Tang family, everyone in the Tang family knew that young Master Yi was recognized by Mr. Tang and was highly regarded. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stayed for so many years. Moreover, young Master Yi was likely to take over Boyi and become Mr. Tang's successor. The matter between young Master Yi and Little Miss was also natural. It seemed that they had been a couple since they were young. Only someone like young Master Yi was worthy of such a petite and cute girl like Little Mississippi. It was just that he was a little cold. But boys were proud. It was common for them to be cold on the outside but warm on the inside. Auntie Lee couldn't stop smiling. "Young Master, Miss, it's time for dinner." As soon as she opened her mouth, Yi Muyun looked up with a bit of embarrassment in his eyes. He nodded quietly. "Okay." After that, he rolled up the magazine and tapped Tang Sher's little foot. "Dinner time." She was still acting shamelessly, refusing to get up. Auntie Lee saw this and pursed her lips, leaving first. Yi Muyun watched Auntie Lee leave and tapped her little butt again. His voice was a little deeper. "Why aren't you getting up? Do you always not eat like this when I'm not at home?" This time, she was hit so hard that she jumped up. Then she realized that she was inappropriate, and she also saw the touch of passion in his eyes. Blushing, she pulled the hem of her skirt and said in a small voice, "I'm going to wash my hands." He grunted in acknowledgement and stood up. During the meal, her bowl was filled to the brim with nutritious food. She looked up at him and protested, "You're feeding pigs." Yi Muyun quickly and elegantly finished his dinner. He was indeed hungry. He looked up and said in a faint voice, "Aren't you?" Pausing for a moment, he seemed to realize something and chuckled. "I figured it out. You're not a pig, but a rice worm." Her eyes reddened. She hated his high and mighty attitude the most. It was as if she was an idiot. Yes, she was an idiot. She had failed all her exams, and he had donated a library to her so that she could attend school. Moreover, he had taken care of this matter all by himself. Even her biological parents did not know that her results were so bad. As for the parent-teacher conference, he was also the one who attended it. In the whole world, only Yi Muyun knew how useless she, Tang Sher, was. She may have a beautiful appearance, but in reality, she was just an idiot. But even so, He was not allowed to say such things to her. Because he kissed her, she felt that the price was too high. However, after so many years, it was too late for regrets. She could only watch helplessly as he invaded her life, her everything, and claimed to be her boyfriend. Everyone would think that they would get married in the future, even she seemed to be slowly accepting it. Even now, she was still angry when he said such things to her. Chapter 1939. Yi Muyun put down his bowl and chopsticks. He was no longer in the mood to eat. His little milk bun was obviously angry. He just sat there and looked at her quietly. He looked at her as she stuffed the rice into her mouth and chewed it hard, as if the rice was him and she could vent her anger. But even though she was angry, the 18-year-old girl's eyebrows and eyes were bright and beautiful. Yi Muyun was a mature person. As he looked at her, he vaguely remembered that she looked more and more like the young Pei Chichi. However, Pei Chichi was Uncle Tang's wife, and Xiaoxin, who was Cher, was his. His expression became much gentler. He reached out and brushed the hair hanging in front of her forehead and tucked it behind her ear. His voice was also faint. Do you have a grudge against this rice? If you eat it like this, what are you if not a rice worm? Tang Cher's little mouth was full and she stared at him. She looked extremely cute, but her big eyes were filled with tears and looked pitiful. She slowly finished the food in her mouth and lowered her head. She only dared to say softly, "It's none of your business." Yi Muyun sighed in his heart. She was angry again. He rubbed her head with his big palm and rubbed it hard. Her little head was as soft as a small animal. As he rubbed it like this, his heart also started to move, but after all, this was a restaurant. No matter what he wanted to do, he had to restrain himself. The little girl did not want him to rub her head like this, but she did not dare to avoid him. In fact, she could not avoid him even if she wanted to. She endured until the end of the meal. She was angry after all. After eating, she got up with red eyes and ignored him. Yi Muyun sat there and looked at her back with his deep eyes. His whole body was tense. When Auntie Li saw this, she knew that the two little ones were quarreling again. She was not worried. They had been like this all these years. They were still children, and quarreling was a common thing. Auntie Li came over to clean up and teased the young master with a smile. "Young master, just coaxing them will be fine." Yi Muyun nodded reservedly, got up, and slowly went upstairs. Auntie Li stood on the spot and sighed. She could see that the young master loved the young lady very much, and the young lady also liked the young master. However, because she was afraid since she was young, she had always been suppressed. Yi Muyun went upstairs and went to her bedroom first. She stood on the balcony and smoked a cigarette. His body was a little tired. He should be resting, but that little fellow was still angry at him. How could he sleep peacefully? She put out her cigarette and walked to her bedroom, which was right across from his. The bedroom door was closed, but it was not locked, and opened with a twist. The little girl's room was mainly light purple, which was very aesthetically pleasing. Yi Muyun frowned almost imperceptibly. He stepped on the thick white wool carpet and walked straight in. There was no one in the bedroom, and the study room was empty, but her backpack was thrown on an armchair. Yi Muyun walked to the door and looked in the direction of the bathroom. There was a faint sound of running water coming from inside. He walked back and opened her backpack. The more he looked, the worse his expression became. The entrance exam results, all of them failed. Yi Muyun looked at the results and felt that he was only 20 years old, but he already had the heart to raise a daughter. Her IQ was really a waste of Uncle Tang and Auntie Pei's genes, but it was not that she was not smart, but she did not take it seriously. Chapter 1940. Yi Muyun let out a long sigh. He wanted to smoke a cigarette, but he held it in. He strolled back to her bedroom. She hadn't come out yet, so he leaned against the headboard and closed his eyes to rest. In his heart, he was also thinking about how to teach her by example. It was already half an hour later when Tang Cher came out. She stayed in the bathroom for a long time because she heard the door open. At this time, the only person who would enter her room was Yi Muyun. She came out barefoot, wearing only a pink bunny pajamas that reached her knees, revealing a small portion of her fair and tender legs. It was sleeveless and looked rather cool. When she saw the person lying on the bed, she wanted to change into thick pajamas. However, she had just moved a step when Yi Muyun's voice came over faintly. "Come here." Tang Xuan was stunned. Her little feet twisted on the carpet for a long time. She didn't want to go over, but she didn't dare to not go over. He was rather patient, lying down and waiting without even opening his eyes. She had always been afraid of him. Rather than saying he was her boyfriend, it would be more accurate to say that he was the head of the prison. After being in a stalemate for a long time, she finally walked over and leaned against the side of the bed. She pursed her lips and called out in a low voice, "Brother." Yi Muyun opened his eyes and looked straight into her helpless eyes. The moment he opened his mouth, his voice was already hoarse. "Afraid of me?" He knew that she was afraid of him, and he never thought that it was a bad thing. For example, other than special occasions, she was more obedient to him and would listen to him obediently. Tang Xuan shook her head. Her long hair had been washed and was draped over her shoulders, reaching her waist. With a gentle flick, a few strands of hair brushed past the tip of his nose. She wanted to take it back, but he didn't let her. Instead, he took the opportunity to grab it and play with it casually in his palm. He said, "Lie over here." She froze for a moment. It was rare that she didn't listen to him. Instead, she instinctively took a step back. He was sleeping on the bed, and she didn't dare to approach him. This was probably a young girl's modesty. The movement of stepping back hurt her hair. Fortunately, he didn't force it and let go of his palm, temporarily letting her go. "You don't have anything to say to me?" His voice was indifferent as he reached out his hand. After all, Tang Xuan felt a little guilty, and she needed him to show up tomorrow, so she obediently gave him her hand and sat on the edge of the bed. Just as she sat down, he pulled her over, and her delicate body fell into his embrace, tightly hugging him. Her nose bumped into his mouth. It hurt, but she didn't dare to scream. Experience told her that if she dared to scream, he would kiss her right then and there. She was scared to death, but she still reached out and wrapped her arms around his firm waist. She hugged him obediently and let him stroke her head like a pet. Her hot little face leaned over and pressed against his chest. Her voice sounded like a little kitten. "I had an exam a few days ago." Yi Muyun's fingers gently stroked her little head and faintly nodded. She raised her eyes, her gaze brimming with tears. Then she lowered her eyes and said dejectedly, "Fail?" A strange look flashed past Yi Muyun's eyes as he asked her in a serious tone, "Which exam did you fail?" She quickly raised her eyes, but she lowered them even more quickly and said shyly, "All fail." With that said, she waited quietly for him to laugh at her. In any case, she was already used to it. Chapter 1941. But what she saw was his deep expression. His gaze was looking at her as if it was on fire. Moreover, at this moment, she realized that she was lying on her stomach, afraid that he would mess around, so she wrapped her legs around him. In the end, he seemed to be a little excited. Yi Muyun's eyes looked at her deeply. The heat in his eyes made her feel vaguely afraid. She vaguely felt that he wanted to eat her up again, but it wasn't a bite like when they were young. It was something else. But the little girl didn't know what it was. She could only lie in his arms like a little kitten, her little hands hugging his waist tightly, afraid that he would mess around. Yi Muyun let out a long breath and calmed down. He looked down at the little girl in his arms. She was smart to hug him so tightly. She was afraid that he would do something. But if he wanted to do it, she couldn't stop him. Moreover, he knew that Uncle Tang had tacitly approved of their relationship. Even if there was anything, he wouldn't blame him. His plan was to wait for her to turn 20 before they got married. Although it was a little early, since he had set his mind on her, it was just exercising his rights as a husband in advance. Yi Muyun's dark eyes deepened. He reached out and caressed her long hair, caressing it casually. His voice was a little husky for some reason. "You're not afraid?" He grabbed her little arm with one hand and dragged her over. Their faces were pressed against each other. Snow didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Instead, her body came into contact with something that made one's hair stand on end. Eye to eye, she quickly lowered her eyes. Her eyes looked down at her nose, and her nose looked down at her heart. That little look made him both angry and amused. Although it was such a romantic moment, his expression was still stern. Why not? I can teach you. He had just seen the results and hadn't looked at the exam papers. Tang Sher replied with an "oh" and didn't move. But when she felt guilty, her little feet would rub against him. This time, she wasn't rubbing against the ground, but his leg. It seems that you prefer to practice kissing. Yi Muyun raised his hand and dimmed the bedside lamp. Suddenly, the light became dim. Cher stuttered, "No? Let's do our homework." Her voice was pitiful, as if she was about to cry. Hugging her in his arms, he ignored her pleas and kissed her on the lips. She wasn't used to it, and he didn't kiss her often either. He only developed this habit this year. Once he kissed her, he would not let her go within half an hour. Actually, she could still accept it if it was just nibbling on his lips. What she was most afraid of was that he would do something strange. Tang Sher's eyes widened as she watched him close his eyes, a look of enjoyment on his face. She pursed her lips, not wanting him to go deeper. But then he chuckled and bit her lips. She let out a soft cry, and he succeeded. Her little hands gripped his shirt tightly, feeling extremely helpless. Because of the entanglement of their lips and teeth, it had long exceeded her acceptable range. She trembled and wanted to push him away, but she didn't dare to. What was even more outrageous was that he was no longer satisfied with just kissing her. His large palms slid up her pajamas and held onto her hands. She cried out and pushed him away violently. She was panting, her eyes rippling with mesmerizing tears as she stared at him. Chapter 1942. Sensing that she was trying to escape, he reached out to grab her arm and dragged her back. Her little face bumped into his chest and it hurt a little. However, she immediately felt that his heart was beating really fast. Also, the 2 buttons on his shirt were undone and his skin was very hot. She did not know much about the matters between men and women. She only knew that when he did this, he wanted to eat her up. She lay on her stomach and did not dare to move. He said hoarsely, "I won't do anything." Nothing happened yet? He had clearly touched her. This was the first time he had done this to her. Would he do this more often in the future? She thought in horror. However, just as she was thinking about it, he had already grabbed her again. His other hand was still holding her waist so that she could not escape. His face was buried in her neck. With a hoarseness that did not match his age, he said, "I won't do anything more." He was a grown man and had a certain curiosity towards the female body. And he only wanted to have her, so the person who could satisfy his fantasies could only be her. Yi Muyun had never felt that he was being domineering like this. He only felt that his fingers were about to melt and he could not bear to let go of her. She was half crying and half begging, "Brother, don't." This call of brother pulled him back to his senses and he finally let her go. He allowed her to get up and retreat far away. He sat up as well and looked at her guarded little eyes. With a smile, he said, "Wait for me in the study." After saying that, he walked towards the bathroom. Tang Shui stuck her tongue out at his back. He had been so impatient just a moment ago, but now he was all serious again. Pretentious. She snorted softly and her little face was red. She pulled up her pajamas and ran to the study barefooted. Although she was stupid, she was still a little smart. She could tell at a glance that the bag had been touched. She carefully looked down and clenched her fists. Her expression was angry. This was too much. He clearly knew that she had failed, but he still tricked her into kissing him. Thinking of the situation just now, her body trembled a little. Her fingers also gently held the place he held just now. Only then did she remember that she did not wear any underwear. In the past, she did not pay attention in front of him, but in the future, she did not dare to be careless anymore. Tang Sher was blushing when Yi Muyun came out of the shower. His hair was almost dry, and he only had a bathrobe hanging loosely on his body. Even so, he was still bewitchingly handsome. She obediently sat behind her little pink desk and sat upright, just like a primary school student. Yi Muyun glanced at her indifferently, walked in front of her, and casually sat sideways on the table. She didn't dare to move around for fear that she would see something she shouldn't. "Where are the papers?" He looked at her. Snow handed it to him, her expression careful. When he took it, he glanced at her again. However, he quickly lowered his head and said while looking at the papers, "I can understand the math and physics, but English?" He did not finish his sentence because he saw her saliva stains on the paper. He stared at it for about a minute before he looked up at her. "You fell asleep during the exam?" Tang Sher and Xiaoxin were sitting together. Her little hands were clasped together, and her eyes drifted to the side. She lowered her head and replied honestly, "I was sleepy during the exam." "Then what did you do at night?" His voice was slightly strict. He was really disappointed that she did not meet his expectations. Chapter 1943. Those words were like a sharp weapon. Coupled with her innocent eyes, Yi Muyun could not help but want to hug her in his arms and kill her. However, he was always a restrained person. He just looked at her indifferently and his voice was even colder. "Is that so?" She obediently agreed, then carefully got up and walked in front of him. She hugged his arm and softly called out, "Big brother." Yi Muyun, on the other hand, didn't fall for her trick. She looked at her condescendingly. "What are you all thinking?" Cher widened her eyes and bit her lips. She thought for a long time but could not think of anything. "Do I need to think about this?" He stretched out a finger lazily and knocked on her head. There was a hint of reprimand in his voice. "Stupid." It was not that he did not feel a sense of loss. He liked her. He had her now and her future. As long as he wanted, she could become his real woman at any time. However, there was always some dissatisfaction in the depths of his heart. They were 2 years apart and he had loved her for so many years. But she did not know how to love. His mind was filled with thoughts, but his face was still cold as he looked at her disappointing and coquettish little face. Shui Er hugged his arm shamelessly, rubbing her head against his arm like a little kitten. He could not do anything about it. His heart was a little agitated, but he scolded her. "Sit down." She sat down obediently. The young man, who had just returned from a business trip and was still jet-lagged, helped her to answer the questions one by one. In the beginning, she was quite serious. But within half an hour, her little head was nodding. He knocked her from time to time, but it was useless. The unmotivated little girl sprawled on the study table and fell asleep after an hour. There were 2 lines of saliva hanging on the side of her red lips. Yi Muyun glared at her with disdain in his eyes. However, his fingers reached out slowly and wiped away her saliva gently. He scolded softly, "Idiot." He was no longer angry. He had been like this for the past few years. How could he still be angry? Punishing her and accompanying her to study were the best ways he could think of to accompany her. But she did not understand. Stretching out his hand, Zhang Xian brushed aside the hair on the little fool's forehead, revealing a beautiful face. He thought to himself that although she was stupid, her appearance was blessed by the heavens. She had shed the baby fat she had when she was young, and now she had grown into a slender and elegant woman. Her skin was like a peeled egg. His slender fingers gently rubbed it twice. His gaze was a little deep and serene for a long time. Then he bent down and picked her up, walking straight to her bedroom. Probably because he had disturbed the little girl's sweet dream, her crystal-clear eyelids opened for a moment and then closed again. Her 2 little claws rested on his neck, and she buried her little face in his neck again. She rubbed against him and finally slept even more soundly. Yi Muyun lowered his head and called her an idiot again. Only then did he hug her and lay down on the soft bed. This bedroom was filled with the fragrance of a young girl. He could smell it just by lying down. However, none of this could compare to the scent of the milk buns in his arms. He lowered his head and inhaled the fragrance from her neck. He laughed softly and pinched her nose again. "Idiot." Chapter 1944. His bathrobe had loosened a little from her rubbing against it, but he didn't care. He let her sleep and let her grab his fingers. This was the first time his little one had done this to him. That tender little finger was like a little enoki mushroom wrapped around him. It was soft and fragrant, and his heart was filled with endless satisfaction. He turned his head to the side and pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. His body was tired, but he couldn't bear to fall asleep. He opened his eyes and looked at his little buns. Then he broke free from her little hand and raised his hand to turn off the lights in the bedroom. In the darkness, the young girl's fragrance was magnified, and the soft little body in his arms made him feel uneasy. He knew what it was, but she was really too young. He didn't want to take away her first time before she turned 20. His fingers found her lips in the darkness and touched them lightly. His dark eyes suddenly opened and he stared at her with a burning gaze. The little girl's body trembled, and her long and thick eyelashes trembled slightly. Yes, she was awake, but she was pretending to be asleep. Even with her eyes closed, she could still feel that he was looking at her with that murderous gaze again. After a long time, she still couldn't hold back her fear. She instinctively bit her lips, but accidentally bit his finger. She closed her eyes tightly and didn't dare to open them. "Do you think you'll be fine just like that?" His voice was especially cold in the dark, as if he could shake ice beads out. Tang Sher sighed in her heart. How could people be so different from each other? She didn't make a sound and just hugged his waist like a rascal. His body froze, and then she felt that horrible sensation again, but he didn't do anything to her. Instead, he stroked her long hair and said in a rough voice, "Go to sleep." She heaved a sigh of relief and obediently nestled in his arms. Actually, she wasn't used to sleeping with him, and they didn't sleep together every day. But on the first day he came back from a business trip, he insisted that she sleep with him. She attributed this to the fact that he probably hadn't smelled the buns for a long time outside, so Tang Sher secretly thought to herself, actually, he hasn't weaned off milk yet. With this thought in mind, she lay on her stomach in a pleasant mood and fell asleep soundly. The first ray of sunshine in the morning shone into the beautiful bedroom, and she moved uncomfortably. Her waist tightened, and she opened her eyes to look at the handsome face in front of her. He was already awake, but did not open his eyes. He only lightly asked, "Xiaoxin, what time is it?" He rarely called her that anymore. Cher grabbed the alarm clock. 7 o'clock. His eyes were still closed. "What time is your first class?" Tang Sher tilted her head and thought for a moment. 9 o'clock. As soon as she said that, she was kissed on her little mouth. Her lips felt warm and she was in a daze. His voice was slightly hoarse. "Sleep until 8. Then she was completely in his arms, and he held her as if she was a doll. Little Cher's face was pressed against his chest. His bathrobe had already come undone. She could feel that he was very hot. Not daring to move, he could only lie down obediently. He seemed to be very tired and fell asleep again. The little girl lay in his arms, bound by his long arms and legs, and suffered for a full hour. When he woke up at 8 o'clock, her feet were numb. She wanted to complain, but she didn't dare to. Chapter 1945. She had always been afraid of him. He was a man of his word, so 10 minutes later, she was already downstairs in the dining room. Yi Muyun sat in the dining room. His long life as a trapeze artist had made him used to eating quickly. In front of him were 3 simple meals and a glass of milk. In front of her were donuts, corn soup, mashed potatoes, and a pure strawberry milkshake. He glanced at her. He had never approved of her breakfast, but he didn't say anything since she liked it. "Come here." His voice was calm and dignified. It was probably because he was used to being a leader in Boi. Tang Shui sat beside him and ate her breakfast in small bites. Her eating speed was like a kitten's. After Yi Muyun finished eating, he contacted his secretary in the 10 minutes he waited for her. He took care of the basic matters and told her that he wouldn't be going to the company in the morning. His secretary also knew the reason. Putting down his phone, he looked at the little girl who was still fighting. His slender fingers landed on the table and gently tapped twice. This meant that she didn't have much time left. The little yellow bun looked longingly at the last donut and swallowed hard. Then she raised her head and looked at him eagerly. Yi Muyun sighed inwardly. She really worked hard. He had never seen her so dedicated to anything else. He picked up the donut and gently stuffed it into her little mouth. He said calmly, "Let's go." Naturally, he held her little hand and walked to the sports car parked on the lawn outside. The little girl's soft and tender little hand struggled for a bit before she safely rested in his palm. Moreover, she was leaning back, so he was basically dragging her along. However, Yi Muyun didn't get impatient and pulled her along in a good mood. Before getting into the car, Tang Sher finally finished the donut and secretly wiped her little mouth. Yi Muyun opened the car door expressionlessly. She stuck out her tongue and got into the car. He closed the car door and went around to get in. He buckled his seatbelt and turned his face. "Have you thought about what to say?" She let out an ah and stared at him blankly. Her rosy little lips were slightly opened. That look, no matter how you looked at it, was cute and hateful. Yi Muyun narrowed his eyes and said slowly, "Wipe your mouth." She was stunned again. He reached out and patted her little head lightly. "You're so stupid." His tone was filled with disdain, but his voice was already hoarse. The little girl obediently picked up a tissue and wiped her mouth. He reached out and pinched her again. His voice was even colder. "So stupid." Cher pouted and turned her face to the side, ignoring him. He was angry. She was angry, but the handsome young man seemed so happy. An imperceptible smile appeared on his lips as he started the car. He was focused on driving and didn't talk to her. The angry little girl couldn't maintain her composure for long. She secretly turned her head to look at him. His side profile was well defined. Because he was young, his face was smooth and pleasing to the eye. After she saw it, she became even angrier. How could such a fierce person be so good-looking? Although she was angry, the car was driving so smoothly that she wanted to sleep. Chapter 1946. The car window was rolled down a little, and the spring breeze caressed her face. The warm sun shone on her face, making her forehead look even brighter. His facial features were so exquisite that they couldn't be any more exquisite. In his heart, he often thought, how could someone so smart be so stupid? But what could he do? No matter how stupid she was, she liked him. There was nothing to dislike about it. He looked at her sleeping face for a long time, and finally leaned over and kissed her forehead lightly. She frowned slightly. When she woke up, she felt a sharp pain on her cheek. "It's fine if you're stupid, but you're so lazy." In front of her was a handsome face with a cold expression. His voice was also cold. His hand was still pinching her cheek. "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." Little Cher cried miserably, not daring to pull his hand away. He would occasionally teach her a lesson, and if she resisted, she would end up worse. The indifferent young man finally let go of his hand and wiped his hand with a napkin. His voice was elegant and pleasant. "We'll go straight to class later. I'll talk to the class counselor." Because of the pain from his pinching, there were tears in her eyes, which made her look extremely lovable. But he didn't relent. His gaze was indifferent, as if he was waiting for something. Tang Sher knew that she couldn't endure it. She suppressed her dissatisfaction and called out softly, "Brother?" But in her heart she was thinking, "Brother is bad, brother is bad." How could Yi Muyun not know what she was thinking? He snorted softly. "Thank you, brother," the little girl said reluctantly again, but he still didn't open the car door. She was extremely annoyed, but she still looked obedient on the surface. She unbuckled the seatbelt and climbed onto his shoulder. She lowered her eyes, put her little face in his arms, and raised it slightly. She looked very obedient, just like the countless times when she had made a mistake. She would voluntarily put herself in front of him and let him kiss her. Actually, it was the same when he kissed her for the first time. She was terrified, and he helped her clean up the mess with a straight face. After that, he pressed her down and kissed her. Those hot lips and tongues intertwined, making her tremble uncontrollably. Although she was stupid, she was smart in this aspect. If she made him unhappy, she would let him kiss her little mouth and let him do whatever he wanted. Only the heavens knew that what he wanted was far more than this. What he wanted was more terrifying than she could imagine. His gaze was deep as he looked at her raised face. Her eyelashes were trembling slightly. It was obvious that she was afraid. He lowered his head and bit her lips lightly. His voice was slightly hoarse. "Get off, idiot." "That's it?" Flustered, she opened her eyes, and their eyes met. He did not shift his gaze away. His black eyes, which were originally filled with anger, were tinged with a faint smile. Her face, however, turned red. "Great Demon King, why do you look so good?" He unlocked the car. She opened the door and got out, running fast with her bag. Yi Muyun didn't get out of the car immediately. Instead, he opened the window. The car window rolled down, and he took out a cigarette from the central control. He lit it up and took a long drag. "I've endured for a long time." With a cigarette in one hand and a cell phone in the other, he made a call. However, his gaze was fixed on the little girl's back until she disappeared from his sight. Little did he know that in other people's eyes, he was also a scenery. The expensive sports car was already eye-catching, not to mention the noble and handsome man sitting in the car. Chapter 1947. Yi Muyun quietly finished his cigarette and got out of the car with his phone. He was young after all. Unless it was a necessary occasion, he would not dress too formally. He wore a pair of dark gray trousers with a beige sweater. It was simple but insanely good-looking. When he got out of the car, his pair of long legs were especially eye-catching. The passing girls almost screamed. Yi Muyun walked straight to the office building and settled the matter with the young girl. Of course, he paid a price to get her from failing all her exams to straight A's. Since the class tutor was handling the matter urgently, Tang Shui wasn't surprised when the scores were announced. She had been doing this since the first year of high school. The most exaggerated time was when she fell asleep during an exam and got a 0. Although he helped her, her little mouth was almost swollen from his nibbling. She never knew that someone could kiss so fiercely. Would he be happy like this? After the class tutor announced the scores, his gaze landed on Tang Shui with a meaningful look. She was not to be trifled with. She naturally knew about that young Mr. Qin. He was President Qin of Boyi College. If everything went well, he would be the future successor of Boyi College. But was he sure that he doted on his girlfriend like this? Wasn't he hurting her to death? Looking at Tang Shui's face, the class guide had mixed feelings. With a face like this, there was nothing good about her. It seemed reasonable. As long as she was good-looking, she didn't need talent. With her family background, she didn't need to rely on her face, not to mention her talent. Cher had long been trained to be thick-skinned. She gladly accepted such grades. Actually, the class guide was the one who was freaking out. Getting an average grade was good enough. This young President Qin was very domineering. He had to make his girlfriend happy and get first place in the whole grade. This good-for-nothing campus belle's image of being the first elite would collapse one day. What should he do then? Who would clean it up? This time it was to donate to the library. What would she donate next time? After the morning class, Zheng Xini, who was sitting next to her, looked at her cautiously and smiled. "Shui, you did well on the exam this time. First place in the whole grade, you're amazing." Cher was puzzled. First in the whole grade? The last place was still the first place. There wasn't much difference even if it became the first place. He smiled. "It's all right." After that, Cher tilted her head. "Oh yeah, how did you do?" Zheng Xini came from City H. She was a straight A student in City H. She wasn't too pretty and was slightly plump. She was different from Cher's exquisite figure, but she was good at studying. Cher asked with a subtle expression on her face. But how could a young girl who was born insensitive notice it? "It's okay," Zheng Xini said softly, clutching her report card tightly. "Total score, second in the whole school. If it weren't for Tang Shui, this stupid horse, she would be the first in the whole school." Zheng Xini had seen Tang Shui's score before. It was supposed to beat Full River Red, but now, she felt humiliated. It was humiliating to be ranked behind a student with such poor grades. But she couldn't say it out loud. She didn't want to tell others that she was the second in the whole school. It was just that this time, the results were on the list. The whole school would know very soon, the freshman of B University, Tang Cher. Not only was she beautiful, she was also a straight A student, the first in the whole school. Chapter 1948. However, Tang Cher's looks were not low-key. She was miserable beyond words. Actually, she knew Yi Muyun's sinister intentions. He wanted to help her rise to the top, so she had to work hard. But she felt that she was innocent, and he would always find a way. Yes, in her mind, no matter what happened, he would always find a way to solve it. So, she continued to do whatever she wanted, eat, sleep, and sleep with a clear conscience. This kind of life was wonderful, except for the fact that the devil didn't travel much lately. He seemed to be very free. At B University, it was drizzling like silk. Zheng Xini stood in front of the rankings, her face drenched in rain. She looked at her name, which was in second place. There was a difference of 5,000 yuan between first and second place, and this 5,000 yuan was her parents' monthly salary. She cared about first place not only for her pride, but more importantly, the 5,000 yuan. She stood there in a daze, her eyes moving to the senior ranking list, looking at the top of the third-year list. A familiar name, Zhou Chongguang. The ordinary face, the ordinary eyes, began to shine with an extraordinary light. She once told herself that one day, she would definitely be on the same level as this person and stand at the same height as him. But she still lost to a good-for-nothing beauty. The rain was getting heavier, but Zheng Xini still stood there motionless. From afar, many students were secretly poking at her. Poor Xini, the class director told her that it was a first-class scholarship, but now it's suddenly dropped to a second-class scholarship. She can't take it. Yeah, Xini's family isn't very well off. We all know that, yes. But she has a background, what can she do? Shui stood not too far away, her face a little tense. She had heard everything they said. She didn't know when, but the people who were talking saw her, and they all fell silent. No one dared to offend her. Cher didn't say anything, and walked straight to the school gate. She must be angry. What should we do? Will she use her connections to expel us? Xin, aren't you close with Tang Xuan? Please put in a good word for us. We offended her because of you. Zheng Xini turned around slowly. Her face was covered in water as she watched the girl leave. Her back view was also so moving. They were in a completely different world. She looked at him for a long time before saying softly, "Don't worry, she's not that kind of person." The girls were relieved and started gossiping. I heard she's Boyi's daughter. I wonder if it's true. It's absolutely true. Otherwise, do you think she has the ability to be number one in the school? I don't think so. I heard that everything at the school was arranged by her brother. President Boyi only has one daughter. How could he have a son? Someone said weakly. Thus, someone began to speculate maliciously, then her background is not clean. Zheng Xini took a deep breath. Stop guessing. It's a fact that she's number one. Everyone fell silent and looked at her with sympathy. After the scene quieted down, a tall and thin figure appeared. He stood in front of the list and looked at it for a while. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. First place. Chapter 1949. Cher walked out of the school and saw Yi Muyun's dazzling Bugatti Veyron. He was a low-key person. Why did he drive such a flashy car? She had asked him once. He looked at her for a long time before replying slowly, "Because I look younger." She giggled for a long time. Younger? He was only 2 years older than her. He was only 20 now, but he already sounded like an old man. But later, she found out that he usually took a chauffeur when he went out to work. She walked over and Yi Muyun got out of the car. She noticed that he was wearing an expensive handmade suit. He must have changed into it at the company and came straight from some formal event. He did not take an umbrella when he got out of the car. The rain splashed on his expensive clothes, but he did not care at all. He opened the door and took the umbrella from her. After she got in, he closed the door and got in. He cleaned himself up with a towel and buckled his seatbelt. He looked at her. Not in a good mood? She rarely felt this way. Most of the time, she was happy without a care in the world. There were many times when he asked himself why he liked her. Thinking about it, it was probably because she liked to eat and laugh. He would be happy when he saw someone happy. As for the other good points, it might be because she looked good, really good, the kind of beauty that he wanted to have at first glance. When he asked that, she lowered her head and fiddled with her little fingers. She said in a muffled voice, "No, it's not bad." Not bad? Her little mouth was almost hanging down. But since she did not want to talk about it, he did not ask further and focused on driving. After passing 2 red lights, the car came to a slow stop at the 3rd. Perhaps to cheer her up, he looked ahead with one hand on the steering wheel and the other rubbing his chin. He asked calmly, "Eating out tonight?" If it was in the past, she would have been happy. But now, she could not muster up the slightest bit of interest. "Forget it, let's go home and eat." If good food could not pique her interest, it meant that she was really in a bad mood. Yi Muyun did not say anything more and drove back to the villa. Sure enough, she was not in a good mood after she went back. Auntie Li could also see that. Her gaze fell on Yi Muyun's face, thinking that the 2 little ones were fighting again. Yi Muyun's young and handsome face only smiled faintly. He reached out and rubbed the little girl's long hair. Auntie Li was relieved. This was probably something else. It didn't matter. With young Master Mu Yun around, even if the little miss wanted the stars in the sky, he could pluck them down. Auntie Li couldn't help but smile. Young Master Mu Yun was really good-looking. His faint smile made her heart flutter. However, none of this entered the little girl's eyes. Right now, her heart was filled with those words. Was 5,000 yuan that important to Zheng Sini? She looked sad. She secretly looked at Yi Muyun and suddenly picked up some food with her chopsticks. She smiled sweetly and said, "Big brother." Auntie Li smiled from ear to ear. The 2 little ones were really loving. It was better for an old woman like her to avoid them. Yi Muyun looked at the food in front of him, then looked at the sweet smiling little girl and Auntie Li who had left. He felt a headache. Although he knew it in his heart, he did not show it on his face. "Why are you suddenly so attentive?" Cher looked at him innocently. "Because you're working hard." Chapter 1950. After a long time, he finally ate it. The little girl heaved a sigh of relief. His voice rang out faintly, "One who is unaccountably solicitous is hiding evil intentions." She glared at him, but it only lasted for a few seconds before she quickly looked down. His dominance was deeply rooted in her. Yi Muyun put down the bowl and chopsticks in his hands and stood up. "I'll go to the study first. I'll bring my bag over to do my homework later." Homework again. The devil! She stuck out her tongue at his back and resisted a little. "Why do I have to do homework every day when I'm in university?" Yi Muyun was already slowly walking up the stairs. His figure was tall and straight, and he looked very good from behind. He didn't look back. As he walked, he said faintly, "Let's talk about it when you can pass without doing homework." She was a little embarrassed and clenched her fists. "I definitely will." At that moment, he stood in the middle of the stairs and looked back lazily. His dark eyes were slightly complicated as he looked at her. Cher's heart skipped a beat and her little face turned slightly red. She thought of a sentence she had read on the internet. "If you were uglier, we could talk about life and ideals. But you're so good-looking, I just want to sleep with you." She didn't want to sleep with him. He was so scary. Under his burning gaze, she lowered her eyes and said in a low voice, "I just want to test your ability." Ability? His beautiful lips curled up into a charming arc, and his gaze deepened. "You'll know in the future." Cher bit her lip. She didn't know why, but her face was burning and her body was abnormally hot. She felt that he seemed to have said something important, but she didn't quite understand it. Yi Muyun's gaze became indifferent. "Come over in a while." She obediently replied with an oath and watched him leave in a dignified manner. At night, she was especially obedient and worked very hard to finish her homework. She didn't eat snacks or secretly doze off. Yi Muyun knew that she had something on her mind and that she was plotting something. However, he didn't say anything and left the study without giving her a chance to say anything. Sleep early. When he said those 3 words, it meant that he had no intention of sleeping with her tonight. Actually, even if they slept in the same bed, he would at most kiss her. He wouldn't do anything too overboard. Slowly, she realized that he didn't mean it that way, so she wasn't so afraid anymore. The little girl immediately stood up and looked at him fervently. She stammered, "Big brother?" He turned around and returned in the same formal suit, but his coat was off and his tie had long since been taken off, but he still looked aloof and handsome. He tilted his head to look at her, his voice as calm as the night sky. "What's wrong?" She sat there, her black hair draped over her shoulders. Her eyes were drowsy, and she carried the innocence of a young girl. "It's still early." He stretched his body and continued to maintain his composure. "I'm a little tired after a 6-hour meeting during the day." "What's wrong?" The little girl pursed her beautiful little mouth. How could she say something as embarrassing as inviting him to her room? She simply lowered her head and said, "Good night." He nodded and smiled. "Good night, Shui." He spoke very slowly and his voice was pleasant to the ears. In the middle of the night, there was actually a hint of seduction in his voice. "Good night just like that?" Her little mouth moved, but she didn't say anything. She could only watch him leave. Imune walked to the door and a faint smile appeared at the corner of his lips. He knew her very well. She wouldn't sleep until she achieved her goal. Chapter 1951. Yi Muyun glanced at her. His young and slender body leaned slightly against the headboard and he bent one leg. Even such a simple action was done very well by him. Cher stood at the door, her eyes a little dazed, and she pulled the collar of her pajamas uncomfortably. In order to achieve her goal, she purposely wore less. The moon-white low-collared pajamas hung loosely on her narrow shoulders. Even though she was not voluptuous, she was well-proportioned, and her skin was fairer than snow. After entering, she closed the door gently and did not have the courage to approach him again. In the middle of the night, in the bedroom where the light was dense, she suddenly shrank back. Just as she was about to escape, she heard his cold voice from behind. "Why are you leaving?" "We'll talk about it tomorrow." She bit her lip and said softly. He smiled faintly. "I'm leaving for New York early tomorrow morning." "On a business trip? A few days?" The little girl was in the midst of her excitement when she felt a chill down her spine. Her matter had not been resolved. How could he leave just like that? Her fair and slender fingers gripped the doorknob tightly. After a long while, she mustered up the courage to look back at him. Yi Muyun put out his cigarette and stretched out his hand to her. She hesitated for a moment and clenched her fingers. After a long while, she moved over and placed her hand in his palm. Her little hand was sweaty and she was obviously very nervous. Standing by the bed, she looked at him with eyes as pure as a kitten. "Brother." His gaze was indifferent. "Did you get into trouble again? HM?" Her long black hair was let down, and her snow-white dress revealed a small portion of her upper body. She looked especially delicious. Her little hands clenched tightly as she shook her head. No?" He was secretly amused, but it was obvious that she wanted something from him. "So you're fine?" He finally reached out and held her waist. "Sleep early." Cher's eyes widened slightly. He usually liked to eat her, but why did he not seem to want it today? His palm was warm and he used some force. "You can't sleep?" The little girl nodded her head vigorously, and after a while, she shook her head. Then, following his strength, she crawled to his side and obediently laid her face on his chest. Afraid that he would do something rash, she hugged his waist with her small hands, as if that would make her feel safer. How could he not know what she was thinking? He did not force her. His body slid down a little, and he raised his hand to turn the lights to the dimmest. Time to sleep. The darkness magnified their presence. Her nose was filled with his alluring scent. His bathrobe had loosened, and her face was in direct contact with his skin. It was slightly cold, but after a while, it started to heat up. It was scalding. Her face was a little hot. She wanted to lift her body, but her waist was held. His voice was exceptionally clear in the dark night. Don't move. Otherwise, I can't guarantee what will happen. She was stunned. Did he mean that when he said he wouldn't guarantee it? She hugged him with her small hands and remained motionless. Yi Muyun smiled faintly and pinched her chin with his fingers. Don't you have anything to ask of me? Turning on the lights, she looked up and saw that his eyes were deep, as if there was a small flame hidden in them. She pursed her lips and seemed to be crying as she called out, "Big brother." It was a little more seductive. His eyes darkened. He stretched his long legs and moved a little. Chapter 1952. She crawled over gently and placed her fair fingers on his shoulders. She closed her eyes helplessly and fearfully before pressing her lips on his. When their lips touched, it was a little hot. She was panicking and instinctively wanted to escape. The moment her body moved, his large palm pressed down on the back of her waist. She cried out. Other than her lips pressing against his, there were other things that she was too embarrassed to talk about. She was already 18 years old. There were some things that she should know, but she already knew about it. Obviously, he was in danger at this moment. Her eyes widened and she struggled a little. He stopped, but his lips were still pressed against hers. His voice was so hoarse as though he had hot sand in his mouth. Have you thought it through? She didn't even need to think about it to escape, but she shrugged in the end. Resigned to her fate, she pressed her lips against his, rubbing her body against his as if she was trying to please him. This was the first time she used her body to please him in exchange for something. He knew her well and knew that she was not doing this for herself. She knew that he would not easily interfere in matters that had nothing to do with her. For her own matters, she would usually pretend to be dead and act shamelessly. He would let her kiss him like a little kitten. It was only when the fire in his body was ignited that he suddenly grabbed her wrist. In a blink of an eye, they were already in a different position. Her black hair was scattered on the pillow. Her face was tender and her eyebrows were fresh. His gaze seemed to be on fire. Suddenly, he looked away and said in a deep voice, "Do you know what you're doing?" She bit her lips so hard that it seemed as though they were bleeding. She looked at him hopelessly and did not realize that her pajamas had slipped down her shoulders, revealing a small portion of her smooth and alluring arms. And the young man's blood was boiling. After a moment, he turned his head back and his gaze was even more passionate. Her expression was innocent as though she did not notice anything. He had always had good self-control, but at this moment, when faced with such a delicate little person, he could not help but lower his head. Their lips and teeth intertwined. His large palm did not hesitate to grab her, causing her to feel pain. She vaguely knew what he wanted to do. Feeling helpless and scared, she clung onto his shoulder, buried her face in his neck, and warmly called him brother. Yi Muyun then came back to his senses and heaved a sigh of relief. He hugged the trembling little person in his arms. She was probably scared to death. This was the first time he had treated her so excessively that it hurt. It was also the first time he had explored a woman's privacy. Between his fingers, there was the remnant fragrance of a young girl, a very secretive aura. He sighed slightly and helped her adjust her pajamas. But when his fingers moved, she let out a soft humph and hugged him tightly, hugging his arms tightly. Like a little animal, she rolled in his embrace, not allowing him to move again. Scared? His voice was indescribably hoarse. Cher nodded, and then shook her head. At this moment, tranquility overflowed with beauty. She finally knew some things about love. He did not dare to move anymore. He patted her back and coaxed her. When she had calmed down, he turned her little face over and looked at her beautiful face. Cher uncomfortably turned her face away. He domineeringly did not allow her to do so. He supported himself with one hand and gently pinched her little chin with the other, forcing her to look at him. His voice was hoarse. In the future, this will be something that happens frequently between husband and wife. There will be even deeper things than this. Cher was stunned. He said, deeper things between husband and wife. Chapter 1953. Cher was dumbfounded. He said, a deeper bond between husband and wife? Then, what was a deeper bond between husband and wife? She looked at him in a daze and called out, brother? His fingers gently caressed her lips, and he slowly moved closer to whisper in her ear. Cher's fingers gripped his bathrobe tightly, and she almost bit her lips until they bled. Wouldn't that be weird? Moreover, wouldn't he be in pain? Also, he would also like that kind of thing. Wasn't he a neat freak and didn't like to be too close to others? The little girl looked at him pitifully and meowed like a kitten. Can I not want it? He chuckled softly and said nastily against her little mouth, but I like it. The tip of his slightly cold nose touched hers gently, and he kissed her gently. I want to eat you up bit by bit. As he said that, he moved to her little neck. It was fragrant and warm. Just a sniff was enough to make her feel intoxicated. He bit her lightly, uncontrollably, and she immediately trembled. He chuckled lowly and pushed himself up a little, looking at her pitiful look. She widened her eyes, and their gazes met. The little girl felt a little wronged, and her eyes quickly became watery. It was too scary. He was going to eat her up again. Her little hands trembled as she caressed the soft flesh. There was still some saliva on it. It was so dirty. But she didn't have the guts to wipe it off, so she could only stare at him. Didn't you say you were going to seduce me? You're already afraid of such a small thing? He laughed and flipped her over, pulling her little body into his arms. He was 184, and she was only 162. She looked very petite in his arms. With his long arms and legs, it was easy for him to trap her. Because of the long period of intimacy, her pajamas were already tattered. His gaze darkened as though it was on fire, and his voice was hoarse. Tell me, what's the matter? He reached out and shifted her to the crook of his arm. He let out a long breath. He really didn't want to take her so early. Yi Muyun always liked to have a plan. At least, he would wait until she was 20 years old. At that time, she should also understand emotions. The two of them were naturally together. She was obedient and submissive in front of him, but sometimes he still felt unsatisfied. Deep in his heart, he was still alone. He told himself that it was because she was still young and did not understand the meaning of love. It wasn't that he didn't want to, especially after he came back from a business trip. Perhaps it was because he touched her that his suppressed desire was triggered. Sometimes he would also wonder, what was he still enduring? But every time he kissed her, she would look confused, and he would not be able to do it. Cher looked at his face carefully. After a while, she said softly, I want to change my results to second place. Yi Muyun looked at her indifferently. He stretched out his long hand, wanting to smoke a cigarette out of habit. This was a habit he had developed over a long period of time. Don't smoke. She hugged him shamelessly and rested her face on his shoulder. It's too choking. He turned his head and looked at her steadily. He said slowly, do you hate that I smoke? Her heart skipped a beat. She felt that there was a deeper meaning to his words, but she couldn't figure out what was wrong with them. She didn't answer, and he didn't force her. He just put down the cigarette. Chapter 1954. Cher looked up and tugged at the strap of his bathrobe. That's right. I just don't want to be number one. Is that so? His voice was still cold and indifferent. Then you want to be last? Her eyes widened and she shook her head violently. That's not it. Yi Muyun pursed his lips. Tell me the truth. At this moment, his voice was already very stern. If it were any other time, she would have retracted her head and returned to her bedroom. But tonight, she really had something to ask of him. How could she bear to leave? She had a temper too. Seeing his face turn grim, she was in a bad mood. I just don't want to be number one. The corners of Yi Muyun's lips curled up. Her voice was still light. You mean that you don't need me to care about you anymore, right? He was used to having the attitude of a superior, which she hated. He was always high and mighty, looking at her as if she was a lowly creature, making her feel like she was worthless. She struggled and wanted to get up, but he stopped her. "Don't move." Cher lay on the ground angrily, burying her face in the crook of his arm. She opened her mouth and bit hard on his shoulder. Yi Muyun's body froze for a moment. He looked at her head with a deep gaze. Instead of getting angry, he chuckled. "You've become a puppy, huh?" She ignored him and lay on the ground, looking as though she would get angry if he didn't agree. Naturally, Yi Muyun wouldn't take the initiative to agree. He looked at her. She lay on the ground shamelessly. That look was both infuriating and amusing. He tugged at her long hair and said unhappily, "You bite me when you don't get what you want, huh?" She raised her little face and pursed her lips. Her eyes were also watery. His heart softened. He carried her over and kissed her on the lips. "Beg me." Cher's eyes widened. She bit her lip. "I begged you just now." And he had already kissed and touched her. She couldn't be so shameless. Yi Muyun's lips curled into a faint smile as he looked at her. "Do you think this matter is easy to deal with?" Then he added, "I didn't open the school, and it's run by the government." "I know Big Brother can do it," the little girl said teasingly as she buried her face in his neck and rubbed against him. But his little body was also trembling slightly, afraid that he would act up again. Yi Muyun's big palm was placed on her back, and he was having an internal struggle. This was difficult, but it was not impossible. However, he was calculating how much he should get from her in order to be worthy of his efforts. After a while, he bit her little ear and said a few words. The little girl clutched her pajamas tightly and looked hesitant. After a while, she said, Then I'll take it off after you turn off the lights." Yi Muyun sneered, "Can you still see if the lights are off?" The little girl stuttered, biting her lip. He was shameless. Why did he have to look at her? With shame and anger, she did as he asked. Unexpectedly, not only did he look at her, but he also nibbled on her. She sat in his arms, scared and helpless. She lowered her head and looked at him. Her eyes were watery, and she sounded like she was about to cry. "Are you done?" How could he be done? He was just enduring it. That night, he turned her over and over, looking at her clearly and kissing her thoroughly. Every inch of her was imprinted with his mark. Chapter 1955. She patted his face with her little paws and said in a soft voice, "Brother, I want to sleep." He looked at her angrily. This was his ultimate goal. However, the little girl fell into a deep sleep and drooled in his arms. He couldn't do anything to her. Yes, Yi Muyun's excellence was nothing in front of Tang Cher. In her eyes, he was not as attractive as a pork knuckle. Early in the morning, when Cher opened her eyes, she didn't see the devil. She lifted the blanket to check. Fortunately, her pajamas were still on. Thinking about it, he was quite a gentleman. That was why she dared to sleep on the same bed with him. After another half an hour, she calculated the time and rushed to the bathroom to take a shower before he came back. She felt that her body was covered with his saliva. When Yi Muyun came back, there was no one in the bedroom, so he thought that she had gone back to her room. He smiled and took off his sportswear as he walked and threw it on the sofa. He opened the bathroom door and was stunned. She was taking a shower. Her back was facing the door, and her long hair was dyed with water. It looked like seaweed was draped over her back, and her silky body was smooth and attractive in the morning light. His Adam's apple moved uncontrollably. He didn't go over to take a shower with her. Instead, he leaned against the door lazily and his gaze was deep. When Cher heard the sound of the door opening, she was shocked. She instinctively covered her body, but she couldn't care less. She sounded exasperated. "Get out." After saying that, she widened her eyes. Because where were his clothes? It was the first time she had seen it. She was frightened and covered her eyes with her hands, but he had seen it for nothing. "If I remember correctly, this is my bedroom." His tone was calm, but there was a tinge of nervousness in it. Then he walked towards her. She could hear his footsteps even though she was covering her eyes. Frightened, she leaned against the wall behind her. She turned her face away and covered her eyes with her hands. Her voice was trembling. "Don't come over." Her hand was taken away and caught in his. She was forced to look at him. She had never looked at him like this before, under such clear light, and she had never looked at him. The little girl blushed and refused to look at him. Abruptly, her hand was raised high and pinned against the wall, while he stepped forward and firmly pressed against her body. The young man had been suppressing himself for a long time. At this moment, how could he hold back? He lowered his head and kissed her. He wasn't gentle at all. From his body to his heart, he was filled with plunder. She was terrified. He didn't seem to want to endure it anymore. Was he going to kill her? The little girl struggled hopelessly, calling him brother, but the more she cried, the more seductive he felt. Until she no longer had any strength left, her little face drooped down, her little body trembling slightly, and she could no longer stand. He carried her to the bathroom and took a quick shower before heading to the bedroom. "Brother." She grabbed his shoulder and buried her face in his neck. His footsteps didn't stop as he carried her over and laid her down. He grabbed a large towel and wiped her clean. He wrapped her up and said in a hoarse voice, "Go back to your room and change your clothes. Wait for me downstairs for breakfast." After he finished speaking, he leaned forward and kissed her on the lips. Chapter 1956. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Yi Muyun got up and walked to the bathroom. She stared at his back and swallowed her saliva. Although there was no way to compare them, she knew that in some aspects, he was just as blessed by nature as he was on the outside. She suddenly covered her face. It was so scary. She listened to the sound of water in the bathroom. After a while, she jumped up and ran back to her bedroom. In the bathroom, after a round of indulgence, Yi Muyun leaned against the bathroom wall with a faint smile on her face. She must have been scared out of her wits just now. By the time he got changed and went downstairs, the little girl was already downstairs. She looked at him, timidly. He looked at her attentively and walked to her side. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Hurry up and eat." She lowered her head. But after a while, she remembered something. She looked up and glared at him. "Didn't you say you were going on a business trip this morning?" That was why she had hurriedly kissed him. And he was still at home. Yi Muyun ate gracefully and glanced at her. "Did I say that last night?" "You did." Xiaoxin was angry and clenched her fists. The corner of Yi Muyun's mouth had an obvious smile. "Then I might have remembered wrongly." "Shameless. Shameless." She bit her lip. She was angry, but no matter how angry she was, she still needed his help. From the time they ate to the time he sent her to school, she had been obedient and didn't dare to provoke him. At the school gate, he stopped the car and opened the door for her. "I'll pick you up at 5:30 p.m. Don't run around." Cher didn't get out of the car immediately. She looked sideways at him and asked, "Aren't you supposed to go in with me?" He smiled faintly. But before she could say anything, he seemed to have remembered something. "I forgot that you crawled into my bed and begged me for a long time last night." "About the second time?" She was a little embarrassed. She clenched her fists and endured it. Actually, to her, Zheng Sini's 5,000 yuan was nothing. But she couldn't give it to him. That was a girl's pride. She would rather not have her pride in front of the devil. Anyway, she had been like that for so many years. She lowered her eyes and grunted, feeling wronged. He smiled, took out his phone, and dialed a number. Cher wanted to listen, so she leaned over and hugged his arm, looking at him eagerly. Yi Muyun glanced at her and waited for the call to go through before saying, "Change Tang Cher's results. Change it to his second place." When he spoke, he looked at Cher with a mocking gaze. If it wasn't for the fact that she was asking him to do something for her, she would definitely be furious. He didn't know what the other side said, but he hung up. Done. It was that simple. She stared at it for some time, feeling that she had been cheated last night and this morning. Seeing that she was not leaving, Yi Muyun guessed what she was thinking. He leaned over and kissed her lips, chuckling. "If you have such a request in the future, feel free to ask me." Glaring at him, She quickly pushed him away and ran out of the room. Behind her, she heard his low chuckle. She swore that she would never ask for anything from him again. Bad guy, pervert. When she reached the classroom, her face was still red and hot. She was afraid that someone would find out that she had done something bad last night, even though she didn't do it in the end. The moment she entered the classroom, countless gazes swept over her. She lowered her head and sat in her seat. Beside her, Zheng Xinyi's hesitant voice drifted over. Did you do it? Do it? Cher was shocked. Did others know that she and Yi Muyun had done it halfway? She denied it instinctively. No, I didn't do it. Chapter 1957. With that, Cher came back to her senses. She knew that Zheng Xinyi wasn't talking about that. She coughed lightly. I don't know what you're talking about. She had an innocent face to begin with, and her words were deliberate, making her look especially innocent. Zheng Xinyi's gaze landed on her face for a long time before she forced a smile. Nothing. At this moment, a classmate came over to congratulate her. Xinyi, you'll get a scholarship worth a few thousand yuan. You have to treat us. Of course. Zheng Xinyi pushed her glasses and looked at Cher with a reserved expression. You should go too after school. Cher smiled. I might not be able to. My family will come and pick me up after school. Oh, Zheng Xinyi replied with a long sigh, looking regretful. She paused for a moment. Next time then? Cher nodded. Sure. In fact, there wasn't a next time. That was because the devil wouldn't let her eat outside, saying that it was unhygienic. She sat down quietly, took out her book, and covered her face with it, preparing to sleep. It was spring, so sleepy. The heart needed to grow, so she needed to sleep more. But there would always be a day when she slept outside. During the elective class, the white-bearded teacher called the roll. The little girl sleeping over there will answer this question. The classroom burst into laughter. However, the sleeping child was still sleeping soundly. She dreamed of chicken thighs and moved her little face, leaving a trail of saliva. The white-bearded teacher stood in front of her, still smiling. Little girl, get up and answer this question. Zheng Xinyi had also chosen biology and sat beside Cher. Her face was a little red as she nudged her. Tang Xue, the teacher is calling for you. The little girl finally opened her misty eyes and looked around with a confused expression. Because she had just woken up, her fair face was flushed. Her long eyelashes fluttered, and the corners of her eyes seemed to be sparkling. Her beauty was breathtaking. The moment she entered B University, she had pushed all the other campus belles away. She stood up absent-mindedly and looked around before biting her lip. Teacher, are you calling me? The white-bearded teacher wasn't angry. It was only natural for a beautiful young lady to like to sleep in. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Can you answer me? It was silent below. The little girl looked left and right for a good while, but didn't find any backup. She then stared at the teacher and slowly said, Chicken? The teacher's voice trembled with excitement because he had a hunch that the answer would be very interesting. Sure enough, the little girl didn't disappoint him. She said confidently, because I like to eat drumsticks. The classroom was once again silent, followed by a burst of laughter. The teacher raised his hand to cover his eyes and brows, but he also couldn't help but laugh. He also wanted to laugh. How interesting. The immoral teacher smiled and gestured for her to sit down. That's a pretty unique answer. Cher looked at him. Teacher, is it correct? That's right. Out of love, the white-bearded teacher stretched out his hand to rub his beloved disciple's long hair. The little girl was so pretty, and her temperament was so cute. He coughed lightly. All right, sit down. With that said, his beloved disciple had already sat down, laid down, and continued to sleep. Everyone was silent. They had never seen such an arrogant student who didn't respect his teacher. There was a particularly passionate gaze that stared at the side of her face for a long time. Chapter 1958. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Someone called out and patted him on the shoulder. Chongguang, are you going to play basketball after school? Zhou Chongguang turned his head, a faint smile on his young and handsome face. No thanks, there's a lot going on today. I heard that a few girls from the new cohort are going to join the student council. Zhao Zi smiled and lifted his chin in a certain direction. The first and second cohort of the new cohort are already there. It all depends on whether you like the talented ones or the pretty ones. The pretty girl who had fallen off the altar of the first cohort, her results were probably fake, unless she was a genius. Oh, the little genius had just packed her things and left the classroom. Zhao Zi looked at Zhou Chongguang and coughed. Are you dazed? He muttered to himself, she's really pretty. But I heard she has a boyfriend. Nonsense, she's only 18. She thought that Zhou Chongguang would not answer, but he did. With that, he got up and walked to the empty seat, picking up a piece of white paper from the ground. There was a sketch of a person on it. It was a young man with a cold temperament and a very noble feeling. Beside the sketch, the words, devil, were written in small, round handwriting. It looked rather childish. Zhou Chongguang looked at it for a long time, a faint smile on his lips. Then, he put it in his bag and turned to look at Zhao Zi. Let's go. Hey, what did you take? Zhao Zi called from behind. Zhou Chongguang turned back and smiled. Take a guess. After he walked out of the classroom, he saw a beautiful figure. He quickly caught up with her and walked side by side with her. Cher stopped. What's the matter? Zhou Chongguang coughed lightly. Is this yours? He handed the sketch to her. Cher grunted in acknowledgement. She took it, folded it, and stuffed it into her bag. Zhou Chongguang's eyes were focused on her slender white hands, but he did not leave immediately. Can you tell me who this is? Cher looked at him strangely. She felt that there was no need to say so much to a stranger. It's my brother. Zhou Chongguang didn't suspect anything, because she was good-looking, and so was her brother. All good-looking people looked alike. With his hand in his pocket, he paused for a moment and said hesitantly, the new student council needs new members. Are you interested? I'm not interested and I don't have the time. The little girl directly rejected him, ignoring his status as a straight-A student and school hunk, and walked toward the school gate. Zhou Chongguang followed behind her. You don't know me? Should I know you? Cher didn't stop walking. My name is Zhou Chongguang. Junior year, music major, piano major, he said shortly. Cher just responded with a faint and that was it. At this time, they had already arrived at the school gate, but Yi Muyun's car had not arrived yet. She raised her hand to look at the time. It was 5:25 am for the first time. She looked forward to Yi Muyun's arrival. Zhou Chongguang was also a proud man, and he knew that it was such an obvious rejection. Sighing in his heart, he was about to leave when a white Ferrari stopped in front of them. The car window rolled down, and a familiar face appeared. It was the person in the sketch. Yi Muyun looked at Cher indifferently, and then looked at Zhou Chongguang. Zhou Chongguang felt a chill run through his body when he was looked at like that. That man was obviously the same age as him, but he had an indescribably cold aura. Chapter 1959. The little girl called out softly, Big brother? Her soft voice made Yi Muyun look a little better. He said lazily, Get in the car. He reached out and opened the car door for her. When she got in the car, he took her school bag and threw it into the back seat. Then the car door closed and the car left the school gate at a speed of 0.01 seconds. Zhou Chongguang looked at her. He had heard her call him Big Brother just now. He smiled. So it was really Big Brother. In the expensive sports car, Cher looked at him. Why did you change your car? Yi Muyun replied lightly, but he didn't tell her that he had changed his car because someone else had sat in it today. After a while, he looked sideways at her. Who was that? Cher looked a little dazed. After a while, she remembered who he was asking about. I don't know him. He gave me something. With that said, she unbuckled her seatbelt and went to the back seat to flip through it. When she found it, she showed it to him. Yi Muyun took a glance at it and said seriously, Sit properly. but there was a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Oh," Cher replied and didn't say anything else. She sat up straight. Yi Muyun started the car and said lightly, "Draw me another one when you go back." He had thought that she would be happy, but she only replied dejectedly and didn't say anything else. But after she went home to eat and take a shower, she was stunned when she came out of the bathroom. Because Yi Muyun was in her bedroom, wearing a bathrobe and sitting on the pink sofa. There was a stack of picture books beside him. The little girl walked over. He hooked his arm and she fell on his lap. "When did you draw it?" He hugged her and placed her in front of him. His face rested on his thin shoulder and he inhaled the girl's fragrance. They were separated by only a thin layer of clothing and she felt very uncomfortable. She bit her lip and said in a low voice, "I drew it when I was bored. I've been drawing it for years." He hugged her with one hand and casually flipped through the two thick albums with his other hand. She probably felt too uncomfortable, so she explained, "Actually, you fit the image of a model in my heart." What do you want to design?" He chuckled and nibbled on her shoulder. His voice was quite pleasant. Cher didn't think too much about it. She quickly said, "Wedding dress and accessories." He took a closer look and found many things that did not belong to him. Clothes, watches, and even shoes. He smiled faintly. "Not bad. Where's the wedding gown?" "I don't see it." Cher remained silent. He looked at her and said, "Give it to me." The little girl curled up in his arms and reached for it. She took another book from the shelf on the side. Yi Muyun flipped a page and his face darkened. The male lead was still him, but the female lead was a very fat woman, as fat as a pig. He stared at her for a while before shifting his gaze back to her face. "Brother, don't you think it suits you?" She squeezed out a smile and her skin tightened. Yi Muyun's face darkened even more. He put the book down heavily and her heart skipped a beat. Then he looked at her and sneered. "From today onwards, this pig will be you. Otherwise, you will eat like a pig." Her face fell, but that was not all. He got up and carried her to his bedroom. "Draw for me." Chapter 1960. Her watery eyes widened in shock. As far as her eyes could see, it was too shocking. In front of her was a work of art. Looking at it under such bright lights, she almost drooled. She had always known that he was good-looking. Not only his facial features, but his skin was also naturally noble. One look and she could tell that he was born into a wealthy family. His entire body was exquisite. Although it was not appropriate to use this word to describe a man, she could not think of another word other than exquisite. The little girl stared straight at him at first, then lowered her gaze and accidentally looked at something she should not be looking at. Fortunately, he still had some integrity and left a piece of clothing on. However, she could clearly see that Cher did not know much about love. At this moment, her face was burning and she was indescribably shy. Biting her lips, she half closed her eyes and reached for his bathrobe. She threw it to him and said in a slightly trembling voice, "Put on your clothes first." With the bathrobe stuffed in his arms, she did not dare to be presumptuous anymore. After all, she was no match for him. Yi Muyun's gaze was deep. "How do I draw with my clothes on?" He placed his hand on that piece of clothing. "Or do I have to take it off completely?" "HM? No need." The little girl immediately covered her eyes and screamed. That fragile state was very much like that of a small animal. He was in a very good mood. His fingertips lightly scraped her little face and his slender legs trembled. "Don't pretend to be dead. Get down." Not only did she not get up, but she even laid down and hugged him shamelessly. However, her little face slid down. Something unexpected happened. She was stuck at the place where she should be stuck. From warm to boiling hot, and then to scalding hot, she whimpered again, "Let go of me. You're the one hugging me." His voice was joyful with a hint of naughtiness. His large palm pressed down on her thin shoulders, making her hair stand on end. She groaned faintly, her voice trembling with a hint of tenderness. He could not take it anymore. Torturing her was actually torturing himself. His large palm loosened and she immediately retreated, wanting to escape. However, his leg hooked and she fell to the side. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. Yi Muyun didn't have much expression on his face. He reached out and touched her little face. With a teasing tone, he said, "Be good, I'll let you go after you finish painting." "Really?" She bit her lip out of habit and looked timid. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. After all, they had been together for so many years, so she knew his temper. If she didn't paint tonight, she probably wouldn't be able to sleep. So she got out of bed barefooted, grabbed a brush and paper, and sat on the pink sofa opposite the bed to start painting. Yi Muyun's posture was leisurely and his gaze was unfathomable. Looking at him like this, she felt very pressured. However, he was very patient, and continued to lean there, not moving an inch. She was also forced to look at him. He was only wearing a thin shirt. She stared at him for about an hour and felt that she was going to have a pinprick. In order to take revenge, she purposely flattened a certain area to make it look less arrogant. "Done." Her voice was soft. "Do you want to take a look?" His gaze was still deep, and he only grunted in response. Cher didn't dare to hope that he would come over, so she could only bring it over herself. Wearing only her pajamas, she crawled over and leaned on his shoulder softly, handing him the painting in her hand. "You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.